72 hours ago, the People's Liberation Army Navy repositioned three Type 055 destroyer-class warships from their standard patrol configuration in the South China Sea to a formation that every naval intelligence professional in the Pacific Command recognized immediately. It was not a training exercise. It was not a scheduled rotation. It was a deliberate, calculated shift in posture that sent a message to every American carrier group operating between the Strait of Malacca and the Persian Gulf in a language that does not require translation. The message was this: China is no longer watching from the sideline. China has entered the geometry of this conflict, and the Middle East that existed before that repositioning is not the Middle East that exists today. I have spent 30 years studying how great powers signal their intentions before they act, how they move pieces on the board in ways that are visible to the professionals who know where to look, while remaining invisible to the public commentary that shapes the political environment in which decisions get made. What happened in the South China Sea 72 hours ago is the clearest, most deliberate strategic signal I have observed from Beijing since the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1996, and the fact that it has received almost no serious analytical attention in the Western media coverage of this conflict is itself one of the most operationally significant things I can tell you about the information environment in which you are trying to understand what is actually happening. Tonight I want to answer 4 questions that nobody in the mainstream coverage is asking with the directness this moment demands. First, what exactly did China move in the South China Sea? Why did it move it now? And what does the specific composition of that repositioned force tell us about Beijing's actual intentions in this conflict, as opposed to the diplomatic posture it maintains in its public statements? Second, how does China's naval repositioning in the Pacific translate into strategic consequences in the Middle East? And why does the movement of warships 6,000 miles from the Persian Gulf fundamentally alter the operational calculus of every American military option currently on the table? Third, what is the relationship between China's move and the Iranian operational campaign that has been systematically dismantling Israeli military infrastructure over the preceding weeks? And to what degree was Beijing's repositioning coordinated with Tehran rather than simply reactive to events? And fourth, when China enters the geometry of a Middle Eastern conflict through naval positioning in a theater 6,000 miles away, what does that tell us about the architecture of the emerging strategic order, and who actually controls the variables that will determine how this conflict ends? Stay with me, because the answers are going to require you to think about this conflict in a frame that is considerably larger than the one the mainstream commentary has been offering. If this level of analysis is what you have been searching for, subscribe now and hit like so you do not miss what comes next. Drop your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them. And I want to know whether you think Beijing has crossed a threshold from which there is no return, or whether this is still a move that Washington can absorb and respond to on manageable terms. Let me begin with the operational picture, because the specific details of what China moved and where it moved, it matter enormously for understanding what Beijing is actually communicating. The 3 Type 055 destroyers that repositioned 72 hours ago are not general-purpose surface combatants. They are the most capable surface warfare platforms currently in service in any navy in the world, with the single exception of the American Arleigh Burke Flight 3 configuration. Each Type 055 carries 112 vertical launch cells capable of housing a combination of HHQ-9B, long-range surface-to-air missiles, YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles, CJ-10 land attack cruise missiles, and U-8 anti-submarine rockets. In terms of magazine depth, sensor integration, and multi-domain engagement capability, the Type 055 represents a generational leap beyond any surface combatant that China operated as recently as 15 years ago. 3 of them operating in a coordinated formation, represent a surface action group with genuine blue water combat capability that no regional power and very few major powers can engage on equal terms. The formation they adopted following the repositioning is what concerns me most from a professional standpoint. Rather than the standard column patrol configuration that Chinese surface groups use during routine operations, the 3 Type 055S moved into a triangular screening formation centered on a position approximately 340 nautical miles southwest of the Paracel Islands. That formation and that position are specifically optimized for 2 operational functions. The first is the long-range surveillance and targeting of surface vessels transiting the sea lanes connecting the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. The second is the provision of air defense coverage for a larger force operating beneath that umbrella. There is currently no larger Chinese surface force operating in that area that requires air defense coverage, which means the formation is positioned to provide that coverage for a force that has not yet arrived. Beijing is setting the table. The guests have not yet been seated. The timing of the repositioning relative to events in the Middle East is not coincidental, and I want to be direct about why I am confident in that assessment. The Type 055 movement occurred within 18 hours of the Iranian strike package that destroyed the Northern Ammunition Depot network that I analyzed in a previous breakdown. That sequence, Iran executes the most operationally sophisticated supply interdiction campaign in the history of Middle Eastern warfare, and within 18 hours, China repositions its most capable surface combatants into a formation that constrains American freedom of movement in the Pacific approaches, is not the sequence of independent events driven by separate calculations. It is the sequence of coordinated actors executing complementary moves within a shared strategic framework. I have been making this argument for 2 years in the face of considerable skepticism from analysts who prefer to treat Chinese and Iranian strategic behavior as parallel but independent phenomena driven by similar grievances against American primacy rather than as the outputs of an actively coordinated strategic partnership. The events of the past 72 hours have converted that argument from a professional assessment into an operational fact. Now let me address the connection between the South China Sea and the Middle East directly, because I recognize that the geographic distance between those 2 theaters makes the strategic linkage non-obvious to anyone who has not spent time inside the planning frameworks that govern how great powers actually think about force projection and strategic competition. American military power in the Middle East does not exist in isolation from American military commitments in other theaters. It exists as one allocation of a finite global force structure that must simultaneously maintain credible deterrence in the Pacific, sustain commitments to NATO allies in Europe, and preserve the domestic political support required to fund and man the entire enterprise. When something happens in the South China Sea that requires the diversion of American attention, assets, and planning bandwidth from the Middle Eastern theater, the operational consequence in the Middle East is real and immediate, even if no American ship has moved and no American pilot has changed course. The Type 055 repositioning does exactly that. The Pacific Command, which is responsible for monitoring and responding to Chinese naval movements in its area of responsibility, has now elevated its operational tempo and its demand on American intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets in response to what Beijing has done. Every reconnaissance satellite pass, every P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol sortie, every signals intelligence collection mission that is now being allocated to track and assess the Chinese repositioning in the South China Sea is a collection asset that is not available for the Middle Eastern theater. The resource competition between theaters is not visible in any single dramatic action. It operates through the quiet arithmetic of finite assets and competing demands, but the resource competition is only the most immediate and most measurable consequence of China's repositioning. The deeper consequence operates through the escalation calculus that governs every American military option currently under consideration in the Middle East. Every serious military option that Washington is evaluating in response to Iranian operations carries an escalation risk. The question that every option requires answering is not simply what does Iran do in response, it is what does the entire threat environment look like if Iran and its partners respond in ways that create simultaneous crises across multiple theaters. Before the Type 055 repositioning, that question carried a certain level of theoretical weight. After the repositioning, it carries operational weight grounded in a specific force disposition that every American planner can see on their display screens right now. The question is no longer whether China would complicate American escalation options in the Middle East if Washington chose to exercise them. The question is now at what point in the escalation sequence does China's South China Sea posture translate from a constraining signal into an active operational factor? And that question has no comfortable answer in any American planning document currently in circulation. Let me now address the coordination question directly, because it is the most important analytical question this situation raises, and the one that the mainstream commentary has been most consistently unwilling to engage with honestly. The evidence for active coordination between Beijing and Tehran in the current conflict is not circumstantial. It is structural, documented, and visible to anyone willing to look at the operational record, rather than the diplomatic statements that both parties issue for public consumption. In January of last year, China and Iran conducted their third consecutive joint naval exercise in the Gulf of Oman. The exercise scenario, which was described in broad terms in Chinese state media, involved coordinated responses to what the exercise framework called unilateral coercive naval presence, language that maps directly onto American carrier strike group operations in the region. The specific tactical evolutions practiced during that exercise, coordinated anti-ship missile salvos, joint electronic warfare operations, and synchronized communication security protocols are directly applicable to the operational environment that exists in the Middle East today. In the 6 months preceding the current conflict, Chinese technology transfer to Iranian defense industrial facilities accelerated across multiple documented pathways. Guidance system components assessed as Chinese origin have been identified in recovered fragments of Iranian ballistic missiles. Optical terminal seeker technology consistent with Chinese development programs has been identified in Iranian cruise missile variants, and the manufacturing precision evident in recent Iranian weapons production reflects access to machine tool technology that Iranian domestic industry could not have produced indigenously, and that the sanctions architecture was specifically designed to prevent Iran from acquiring. The relationship between what China provided in the years before this conflict and what Iran has been able to execute during it is not a coincidence of parallel development. It is a supply chain, and the South China Sea repositioning is China making visible what that supply chain relationship means for the strategic geometry of the conflict at the moment, when its operational consequences become undeniable. Wang Yi's phone call with the Iranian foreign minister that preceded the current phase of operations by 48 hours, a conversation that Chinese state media described only as covering issues of mutual strategic concern, was not a courtesy call. It was a coordination checkpoint. Two actors operating within a shared strategic framework, confirming that their respective moves are synchronized before the next operational phase begins. The Type 055 repositioning that followed 18 hours after Iran's depot strike campaign was not Beijing reacting to Iranian success. It was Beijing executing its own contribution to a sequence that both parties had already agreed upon. I want to address something about Washington's response to all of this, because what the administration has said publicly about China's repositioning is almost as instructive as the repositioning itself. The official American response has been carefully calibrated to avoid acknowledging the strategic significance of what Beijing has done. Pentagon spokespeople have described the Type 055 movement as a routine naval activity being monitored in the normal course of operations. State Department officials have issued statements calling on all parties to exercise restraint, language so generic that it communicates nothing to anyone. And the White House has maintained a public posture that treats the South China Sea development and the Middle Eastern conflict as separate issues requiring separate diplomatic tracks. That posture is not a reflection of what American officials actually believe. It is a reflection of what they cannot say publicly without acknowledging something that the political environment does not currently permit them to acknowledge, which is that the United States is facing a coordinated strategic challenge from two nuclear-armed powers acting in concert across multiple theaters simultaneously, and that the force structure, the alliance relationships, and the domestic political consensus required to manage that challenge simultaneously do not currently exist in the configuration that the challenge demands. That gap between what officials say and what the operational picture actually shows is the most important thing I can point you toward in understanding the strategic situation right now, because it tells you that the decisions being made in Washington are being made under constraints that the public political debate has not yet absorbed, and decisions made under unacknowledged constraints tend to produce outcomes that the people making them did not intend and cannot fully control. The energy dimension of China's entry into this conflict geometry deserves specific attention because it introduces a variable that transforms the economic stakes of every escalation decision in ways that have not been adequately analysed in the public commentary. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. Approximately 40% of that oil transits the Strait of Hormuz. Under normal strategic circumstances, the dependency creates an alignment of interest between Beijing and Washington around the maintenance of open sea lanes through the Persian Gulf, an alignment that has historically provided a check on how far China was willing to support Iranian actions that threatened regional stability. What the current situation reveals is that China has concluded that this alignment of interest no longer constrains its strategic behavior in the ways that American planning has historically assumed. Beijing's calculation, and I believe this represents a genuine strategic reassessment rather than a temporary tactical adjustment, is that the disruption costs of a Hormuz closure fall more heavily on Japan, South Korea, and the European economies that depend on Gulf energy flows than they do on China, which has spent the past decade systematically diversifying its energy supply chains, building strategic petroleum reserves, and developing alternative import pathways through pipelines from Russia and Central Asia that do not transit any maritime choke point that American naval power controls. China has, in other words, spent a decade reducing its own vulnerability to the energy disruption that a Hormuz closure would produce, while the American alliance system has remained heavily dependent on the continued flow of Gulf energy through that waterway. The repositioning of three Type 055 destroyers into a formation that constrains American freedom of movement in the Pacific approaches, Beijing signaling that it has completed enough of that vulnerability reduction to act with a degree of strategic freedom that it did not possess 5 years ago. That is not a temporary tactical signal. That is a structural change in the global strategic balance, expressing itself in a specific operational action at a specific moment of maximum relevance, and understanding it as such rather than as a routine naval movement being monitored in the normal course of operations is the difference between analysis that prepares you for what comes next commentary that leaves you surprised by it. Let me tell you what I think the next phase of this situation looks like based on the operational logic of what has already been established, because the trajectory is more visible than the public commentary suggests. China's South China Sea repositioning has established a constraint on American escalation options in the Middle East that Beijing will maintain and potentially intensify if Washington's response to Iranian operations crosses thresholds that Chinese planners have defined in their own internal assessments. The specific threshold that concerns me most is any American military action that directly targets Iranian territory in a way that threatens the continuity of the Iranian government rather than simply degrading specific military capabilities. That threshold, regime-threatening military action against a Chinese strategic partner, is the one that Beijing's posture is specifically designed to deter, and the Type 055 formation is the visible expression of that deterrence in its current phase. If American escalation approaches that threshold, I assess that China's response will not be a sudden dramatic entry into the conflict in a way that produces direct Chinese-American military confrontation. It will be a further intensification of the constraining posture, additional naval repositioning, accelerated weapons technology transfer to Iranian partners, increased diplomatic isolation of American positions in multilateral forums, and economic pressure through currency and trade mechanisms that impose costs on American escalation without creating the direct military confrontation that neither side currently wants. That graduated constraining strategy is more effective than direct confrontation because it operates across multiple domains simultaneously, imposes real costs on American freedom of action, and does so in ways that are individually deniable and collectively difficult for the American political system to respond to coherently. It is, in other words, precisely the kind of strategic approach that a patient, self-reliant great power with a long planning horizon executes against an adversary whose decision-making is constrained by electoral cycles, media attention spans, and the requirement to maintain domestic political support for every significant action. Iran has been executing exactly this kind of graduated pressure strategy against Israeli and American interests in the Middle East for 2 decades. China has been watching that execution with the professional attention of an institution that recognizes in it an approach that is compatible with its own strategic culture and its own assessment of how great power competition in the 21st century will actually be decided. What the South China Sea repositioning represents is Beijing's decision that the moment has arrived to add its own graduated constraining pressure to the strategic geometry of a conflict that its partner has been managing successfully and that has reached a phase where Chinese involvement provides the decisive additional weight that converts Iranian operational success into a structural transformation of the regional order. The world that emerges from this moment is not a world that can be explained by the analytical frameworks that the Western strategic establishment built during the unipolar period. It is a world which a coordinated partnership between a sanctioned regional power with demonstrated precision strike capability and a peer competitor with global naval reach has produced a combined strategic challenge that the existing American force structure, alliance architecture, and domestic political consensus is not configured to manage simultaneously across multiple theaters. That is an uncomfortable conclusion. It is the kind of conclusion that careers are not built on in the institutions that shape American strategic thinking. And it is precisely the conclusion that the operational evidence of the past 72 hours most strongly supports. 30 years of studying how strategic orders change has taught me one thing above everything else. The moments that matter most are almost never the dramatic visible events that fill the news cycle. They are the quiet repositioning decisions made by actors who have been planning for this moment for years and who execute their moves in the knowledge that the people watching most closely will be the last ones to say publicly what those moves actually mean. 3 Type 055 destroyers moved in the South China Sea 72 hours ago. The Middle East will not be the same because of it. And the strategic order that governed this region for the past 30 years is now being contested by actors whose patience, self-reliance, and long-term planning have produced a combined capability that the institutions built to prevent exactly this outcome consistently failed to take seriously until the moment it became impossible to ignore. Here is the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments. China has now made itself visible in the geometry of this conflict through a naval repositioning that every serious analyst recognizes for what it is. If Washington escalates against Iran in a way that Beijing has signaled it will not accept, and China responds by intensifying its constraining posture across multiple domains simultaneously, the American political system have the institutional capacity and the domestic consensus to manage a two-theatre strategic challenge of that scale without one of those theatres breaking in a direction that nobody can control. Because from where I sit looking at the operational picture, as honestly as 3 decades of professional experience allows me to, the answer to that question is the most important thing any analyst covering this conflict should be trying to figure out right now. Leave your assessment in the comments. Like and share this if the analysis delivered something the mainstream coverage is not giving you. Subscribe for the breakdowns that go where the comfortable commentary will not.